Hi, this is Muho, and I want to continue to talk about my teacher's house. This will probably be the second to last part of that series. Let me continue reading from the interview. Edward asks, we spoke before about this idea from the Arthur Braverman's book that he didn't want to leave his teacher's house. Could you speak about your own experience of this? So the Arthur Braverman book that's mentioned here, the title I think is Living and Dying in Zen. And the author of that book, Arthur Braverman, is an old student of Uchiyama Roshi's. When Uchiyama Roshi was the abbot of Antaiji 50 years ago in Kyoto, he belonged to quite a lot of Western students. And he went back to America. I think he's living in California. He translated some Zen books. One I think is called The Zen Warrior. That's about Suzuki Shozan. But also about Sawaki Roshi. I saw that on Amazon they promote a book that's supposed to come up in the autumn by Sawaki Roshi, translated by Arthur Braverman. Anyway, Living and Dying in Zen is about 5 Zen teachers that are all somehow connected to Sawaki Roshi. So it's about Sawaki Roshi, but also about Kato Kozan, a Rinzai teacher that was a good friend of Sawaki Roshi, and about Uchiyama Roshi, his student. And in the either foreword or in the last part of the book, Arthur Braverman talks about how he wrote this book, how he traveled to Japan, and then also about meeting Uchiyama Roshi in his preparations for the book when he interviewed Uchiyama Roshi. And usually during the summer, Uchiyama Roshi stayed in a friend's house in Nagano, in the central, very mountainous part of Japan, because it's cooler there during the summer rather than Kyoto, where he would live during the other months of the year. So Arthur, obviously, he traveled from Kyoto to Nagano and had his interview with Uchiyama Roshi, and it was getting late, and I don't have the book right here right now, but when you read it, you get the impression, or maybe Arthur writes it explicitly, that he is somehow hoping that Uchiyama Roshi would invite him to stay at his house overnight, that they could have dinner together and that he would stay at his house. But then at one point, Uchiyama Roshi's wife says, Arthur, it's getting late, maybe it's time for you to go now. So that's what this question is about. Arthur's talking about this having to leave his teacher's house but being reluctant to do so, hoping that he could stay in his teacher's house. And that, of course, in this case, it's literally, physically, he wants to stay there overnight also, because it's too late to go back to Kyoto, and he has to stay at some random hotel. And if he could stay with his teacher also, they could continue to chat, and it would be nice to share dinner with him and maybe have a glass of sake afterwards. And here in my answer, I take it not in the literal way, but also in a kind of deeper way. Not being able to stay in your teacher's house. Like last time, about a week ago or so, I talked about this metaphor in the Lotus Sutra. The prodigal son, as he appears in the Lotus Sutra, the guy that lives as a servant is at his father's house without even realizing that it's his house. And it's only before his father's death that he tells him, well, actually, you didn't realize, but you've been staying in my house all the time, and actually my house is your house. And I was talking about the similarity to what the father says in the Bible, not to the prodigal son, but to his first son, the son who had stayed with him for all those years. In the Bible also the father says to the son, but everything I have is yours. Don't you realize that this house is your house? And now I'm talking about a different aspect, or kind of the opposite is also true, that to really inherit your teacher's house, you have to realize it's not my house physically, but I have to stand on my own feet to actually be following my teacher's path. I have to leave my teacher's house in order to really inherit my teacher's teaching. So it's like a second home leaving in a way. Like, well, right now many Japanese monks become monks and priests only because they were born in a temple. So for them, it's not a way of home leaving in the first place, but originally, and probably in the case of most Westerners, like myself, it means a form of home leaving when you enter monkhood. You shave your head, you put on the monk's robes, you choose a teacher, and you follow that teacher for maybe several years. But then at one point you have to do the second home leaving, and that can be quite painful, just as the first home leaving can be painful. So today I want to talk a lot about this a bit. Once more, maybe I read the question from Edward. We spoke before about this idea from Arthur Braverman's book, that he didn't want to leave his teacher's house. Could you speak about your own experience of this? My answer: you want to have that good relationship with your teacher. But part of Miaula's character, so Miaula is my teacher, part of his character was that he kept a distance from everyone. That was part of the disappointment that all of us realized when we left Antaiji. You couldn't have that relationship that you would have loved to have, to be on very intimate terms, kind of being always in your teacher's room and always being in his house, so to speak. You couldn't have that relationship. You couldn't stay at his house. You couldn't be his body. Perhaps that was a necessary realization that I later tried to rationalize for myself. Like when Watanabe and Miaula had this falling out half a year or so before I left. So that would be in 2001. It started a little bit earlier. It started around the time Uchiyama Roshi died in 1998. That's the relationship between my teacher Miaula and my teacher's teacher Watanabe got gradually worse. And it seemed that Watanabe wanted to push him out of Antaiji. And that became very clear in 2001, in the early spring, shortly after I had decided that I would leave Antaiji in the summer of that year. Watanabe came here, so he came to Antaiji and called this team meeting in person. That was in May of 2001, I think. Could have been in April as well. He sat in the top spot. Usually that would be the top the spot where the abbot would sit. So that would be the spot for my teacher. But he said, as if he had been the abbot all along. He said in the top spot, and my teacher and ourselves were sitting there in two lines. There was some small discussion. And then at the end of the discussion, Watanabe told Miyaula that he would disown him as his Dharma heir, which you cannot do officially in Sotoshu. What I call here in English disowning as a Dharma heir in Japanese would be hamon. Hamon means to break the gate, and if you look for it on the internet, usually it's translated into English as excommunication. And probably in Christianity that would be the correct term. But excommunication, as well the name says, means that you're not part of the Christian community anymore. So it's something that the church has to decide. While hamon is something between teacher and student. When the teacher tells the student, you are not my student anymore, well, that would be hamon. And when I say it's not possible in Sotoshu is that, well, the teacher has no right to ban his student from Sotoshu. And I wrote about it in the What Does It Take to Become a Full-Fledged Soto Priest series almost 10 years ago, I think. I wrote about that once a teacher gives Dharma transmission to his students, you cannot revoke Dharma transmission. So it sometimes happens also, I think, in the West that teachers tell their students, you're not my student anymore. But if that happens after Dharma transmission, the teacher is still a teacher in their own right. You cannot get the Dharma transmission back, so to speak. Still, even if it happens after Dharma transmission, usually in Zen you, how do you say, you identify with the lineage you're in to a certain degree. So if the teacher says you're not my student anymore, it kind of removes the link between you and the Buddha. The link from the Buddha to you, I mean, there's Bodhidharma, there's the sixth patriarch, there's Dogen. There are all these important Buddhist patriarchs, but then there's your teacher and you inherit it from your teacher. So when the teacher says, you're not my student anymore, that's pretty serious. I mean, I don't have to explain that it's pretty serious, but that happened about 20 years ago, in the spring of 2001. Watanabe came to visit Antaiji. I think at first he was discussing with my teacher what to do with Antaiji, and I think Watanabe wanted to talk my teacher into giving up his position, and my teacher said, no, I'm the abbot, why would I retire just because you tell me to do so? And after that, this team meeting happened where everybody was participating, and basically it was this one sentence at the end: I hamon you, I disown you as my students. But Watanabe had no way to somehow, well, force my teacher out of Antaiji. He couldn't revoke Dharma transmission. He couldn't somehow fire him as the abbot, because he was officially appointed by Sotoshu as the abbot of Antaiji. So Watanabe said that at the team meeting and left. A small detail here, Edward always writes team meeting, while in my mind it always used to be tea meeting, a meeting where tea is also served. But it's also team meeting, at the same time. That shocked everyone there. Yeah, I mean, that doesn't happen so often that the teacher tells their student, "You're not my student anymore," especially when that student is your teacher. So it's basically our teacher that is told by our teacher's teacher, "You're not my student anymore." So then the question is, well, what kind of lineage is this here at Antaiji? Does this mean that we're not in the lineage of Sawaki Roshi, Uchiyama Roshi anymore? As far as we knew, the lineage was Sawaki, Uchiyama, Watanabe, and Miyaura. And we hoped to be part of that chain, but then out of a sudden, one link of the chain was missing. It was said that Watanabe would return as the abbot. So here there's a kind of jump in the conversation. What I just talked about, this team meeting, that happened in April, May 2001. And Watanabe said that he would return as the abbot, that he's the real abbot of Antaiji, but there was no way that he could possibly get back in a, well, official or legal way. I mean, my teacher had the job. He was appointed by Sotoshu. But then the real talk that Watanabe would really come back as the abbot of Antaiji, that's what happened 1 year later when my teacher had his accident. He had died in January. And then at the end of March or so, by the middle of March maybe, there had been this ongoing discussion, so what do we do now? Who's going to be the next abbot? And there were two other people on the board of Antaiji. They didn't live in Antaiji, but they were on the board. They had to make this decision. And they said, well, let's ask Watanabe. He was not on the board of Antaiji, but I mean, well, he's in the best position to run the place. He has been the former abbot. He's also involved himself a lot in the affairs of Antaiji during the last couple of years, so why not ask him to become the next abbot? So that happened in March of 2002, 1 year later. It was said that Watanabe would return as the abbot. When I heard that, I said, okay, I will go to Osaka to live in the park. This is, of course, in 2001. What happened again before that? There was this team meeting. Watanabe told my teacher, "I disown you," and then he got up, went out of the entrance, and then he called me, "Muho, I have to tell you something." And what he told me is, don't move. Don't move. And I didn't reply to that, but I had already made my mind to leave in summer, and I knew, well, it's a good time to leave now. So this is not really a fact. When I heard that, I said, okay, I will go to Osaka to live in the park. I already told that to my teacher in January. But then what happened the following year in 2002, and probably that's where the confusion comes from. In 2002, Watanabe and the person who had to make the decision who's going to be the next abbot, the most important person on the board, they met at Antaiji after my teacher died. Both of them came to Antaiji to meet, and after that meeting it was announced to the rest of us who were staying in Antaiji at the time that Watanabe would become the next abbot. And when I heard that, and I've been living in Osaka for 6 months until then. I'd been living in Osaka in the park, in the tent, from September 2001 until February of 2002. And then when my teacher died, I'd come back to Antaiji. So when I heard that Watanabe would be the next abbot, I said, great. So I get back to Osaka. I will return to my tent to Osaka to live there in the park. And Watanabe wasn't happy with that. So when you read the text of the interview alone, it's hard to understand, because 2001 and 2002, this meeting before my teacher died, and then Watanabe back at Antaiji after my teacher died, they somehow get mixed up here. Watanabe wasn't happy when I told him in the March of 2002 that if he becomes the next abbot, then I would go back to Osaka to teach and practice Zazen in the park. If you don't want to be here with me, he said, then you can become the abbot. I'm not going to do it. So he didn't do it. And in March 2002, it was decided, so basically at the time when this happened, probably that got confused when Edward wrote this report. In March 2002, originally it was said Watanabe is going to be the abbot. I said, great, I'm going to go back to Osaka. When I said that, Watanabe said, well, if you don't stay here, I'm not going to be the abbot. And then the decision was made that, well, let's make Muho the abbot. It was decided that I would be the next abbot. In February, they had said Watanabe, but at the end of March, they said Muho. Well, basically, this discussion was going on ever since my teacher died in February 14th, and the decision was finally made at the end of March. But Watanabe, a year later, wasn't happy with the situation. I think it was in the year 2003. No, probably it was 2 years later. Maybe it was in 2004. Either way, at some point later, after I became the abbot, there was no contact at all with Watanabe. So he, in a way, he hammoned me as well. He also disowned me as his student. A year later, Watanabe wasn't happy with the situation. He still had the opinion that I, as the abbot, would be his student, while I made it clear in the newsletters that I'm not the student of Watanabe. He wasn't very happy about that either, and after I was abbot for 1 or 2 years, he called me to his home, as well as his first student, a Dharma brother of my teacher, whom he trusted the most. Sorry. So that happened in 2004, that I was called to Watanabe's temple in Wakayama, and his first most trusted student also came. And at that time he was pretty angry with me for not, well, looking up to him as my teacher. But then, of course, he never had been my direct teacher. He had been my teacher's teacher, and then he disowned my teacher. So why would I think of him as my teacher? And there was also a conflict with his first student at that time. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of complicated, but Watanabe Roshi's first student also had a good connection with the other guy on the board. And the other guy on the board was tried to be, tried to make everyone feel good about Antaiji. While for Watanabe, Antaiji was basically his temple, his monastery. So he wasn't okay with the idea that his first student would also kind of try to, how do you say, be diplomatic and have a good relation with other guys who had different opinions. So at this meeting in 2004, Watanabe told his first student one thing, which somehow impressed me, and that was, you're not even worth of being disowned. Here again he used this expression Hamon. You're not even worth of Hamon. You're not even worth that I tell you you're not my student anymore. So in a way, that means you have to be worth. You have to kind of own the disowning. You have to own it that your teacher tells you you're not your student anymore. And if you're not ripe for it, then you just haven't earned it yet. For me, that meant, and maybe I'm rationalizing it too much, but this process of being disowned is actually a necessary step of practice. You have to get to that point. You need to be ripe to get to that point where your teacher tells you, get out of my house. Get out of my house. Stand on your own feet. But in the case of his first students, obviously he wasn't ready for that yet. You're not even worth being disowned. This realization that you cannot stay at your teacher's house, that proclamation, now it's time to leave my house, is the disownment. You're not my student anymore. So who are you? Who are you? Don't identify with the lineage. Don't identify with my name. Don't use my name anymore. Who are you? You're not my Dharma heir anymore. It is disappointing when you realize you cannot have that close relation with the teacher. But it is not the fault of the teacher or the student. It can actually be quite dangerous and not productive for the practice to stay in your teacher's house for too long. It doesn't help them to grow. Edward's next question. How did Watanabe go about organizing this team meeting? So now we're back in 2001 in the spring. My answer. There were some short-term guests at the time. I think there were 2 young women that had come only for a couple of days for session. There were maybe 3 or 4 of us long-term practitioners, and then there was a mother with her 3-year-old boy as well. So it was a quite mixed group, but less than 10 people, 7 people or something. Mia-Ula's wife was looking after the kids so that the mother could attend the team meeting, but Watanabe said, get Reiko, get my teacher's wife as well. She should also listen to what I have to say. Watanabe just made me get Reiko and tell her to leave the kid with the guest. So Watanabe wanted my teacher as well as his wife to listen to what he had to say. At the meeting, Watanabe was telling the whole story of how he got betrayed by Mia-Ula, how Reiko was interfering with the Sangha, and how he had to get involved to straighten it out. So it was kind of talking about the whole 20 years or so since Mia-Ula had become the abbot, 15 years or so, starting from that time, and about Reiko's role in Antaiji, with which he obviously wasn't satisfied with. letters that Miaula didn't respond to in the proper way, and other letters that other students wrote to Mia Watanabe in which they bitched about Miaula or Reiko, and how Miaula didn't visit him in Wakayama, stuff like that. So for quite some time he was basically bitching about my teacher and his wife. Edward asks, was that the time he asked you to wait at the entrance in front of the whole Sangha? Exactly. He went to the Genkan, that's the entrance, and called me. He pointed at the floor and said, "You stay here." That was when I knew I had to leave, but I basically made the announcement already in January. Otherwise, it was going to be very uncomfortable, not only for myself, but for Miaula as well. I knew we could not be together anymore. Edward asks, "When did you leave?" I answer, "In July." Those months afterwards were uncomfortable, but we just carried on with the schedule. We never spoke about it. And after that, nothing happened for a while. There were letters exchanged with Watanabe, but he didn't appear anymore, so it seemed like a ceasefire. People probably thought things would be okay, but then the year after, Miaula had his accident. So actually I don't think it was July but August, but it doesn't really matter. I left in the summer, late summer of that year. And the months until then, it was like a Cold War. It was like a Cold War between Watanabe and Miaula, and I was just right in between. Edward, did the way Watanabe started this conflict change your opinion of him? My answer, there was always this idea at the back of the head that maybe he was doing it for the Dharma. So that's also, I think, something that a lot of students try to do, or actually do, when they see the imperfections in the teacher. And it's not just some cute imperfections, but it's actually, well, this clearly goes against the Dharma, that you tell yourself, you try to convince yourself, well, the true teacher does this actually as a koan. This is kind of like a koan. He's posing a koan there. In a way, that's what I did at the time. Maybe there was some deeper reason behind it all. It can't be that he's just thirsty for power or the drama. After all, he's Watanabe, the teacher of my teacher and the student of Uchiyama. So afterwards, I still exchanged letters with him. He came to visit me a couple of times when I was living in the tent in Osaka. I never thought of telling him that I wouldn't want to have any contact anymore, that I thought it was bad and he's just trying to use me. I was just looking for the Dharma value in there, but whatever it was, I couldn't grasp it. Now I'm not so sure anymore. Well, or you could actually say now I'm quite sure that it wasn't a koan, but it was also about power. It was mostly a power game. Edward asks, after he died, did your appreciation for Miaula grow as it did at Tofukuji? So when I came back from my year in the Rinzai temple, I realized how much my teacher had done for me without me appreciating it at all, without me even realizing what my teacher is doing for me. I felt this huge debt on my shoulders. So the question is, did a similar thing occur after Miaula died? My answer, well, actually I expected that would happen, but it was the other way around. especially for the first 5 years or so when I was abbot. I realized that a lot of the things I thought he was doing for the Dharma were not. So I was basically thinking that both Watanabe and Miyaola were kind of having this kind of koan exchange. They were both in this game for the Dharma. And when I became the abbot, I realized no. Or also when Miyaola was drunk at lunchtime and he wouldn't appear for Samu and he was basically only bitching and criticizing us, I thought, well, that's the way a teacher is supposed to relate to students. Maybe that's the way we do it in the Zen school. And after I became the abbot, I realized, well, that's one way you can do it, but it's not the only way, and it's not the most constructive way. Although there's a tendency when you have a bad day to be exactly like that, but that's it's not the only option you have as a teacher. Like if he was drunk in the morning, it couldn't be that he was just an alcoholic. That's what I would tell myself in the beginning. There must be some teaching. Like when Nansen cut the cat, it wasn't just that he was angry. He had a point to make. When my teacher would withdraw into his house, I thought that was a koan too. But when I was in his shoes as the abbot, I started to see where that stuff came from. I wouldn't say I did much better than he did, but I often realized when there was the temptation to do the same, to withdraw and say, I don't want to have anything to do with you anymore. I thought that after he died, my gratitude would deepen. But the opposite was the case, because while I felt the temptation to also withdraw from my responsibilities, put the blame on others, take refuge in alcohol, I knew it wasn't the Dharma. I tried to see that my teacher was somehow teaching something, that he was perhaps trying to destroy our view of how a teacher should be by behaving deliberately in a deluded way. So basically he was destroying our idea of the ideal teacher. But I realized that stuff was just plain delusion. There was no performance. I was surprised how let down I felt during those first 5 years as abbot, because all these delusions were real. When I say all these delusions were real, it's basically my teacher didn't just pretend to not be a deluded person. He actually was deluded to a good degree. When I thought that it was all part of the Dharma teaching. But no, there was no performance. I was surprised how let down I felt during those first 5 years as abbot, because all these delusions were real. Like with the way Watanabe behaved, it's like the way a son might try and rationalize his father's terrible behavior. Well, that's probably what a lot of kids do, who have to put up with difficult parents, that you try to tell yourself, well, they all do it for my sake. And at one point you realize, no, they didn't do it for my sake. This was hard for me, because even though I had a distant relationship with my teacher, I was still idealizing so many things. I didn't realize that he was just falling into all these traps, which I wasn't stepping into, or at least I tried my best to not step into the same traps. how successful I was, other people will have to judge. This revelation I had in Tofuguchi didn't happen when he died. Okay, this is today's part, the second to last part, about my teacher's house and the necessity to leave the teacher's house. To continue the tradition, you have to, in a way, well, you have to step out of the tradition. You have to step one step ahead. Otherwise, the tradition won't continue. It's like with cooking. You have to each day cook new, fresh food. You cannot conserve the same food. You cannot warm up yesterday and day after yesterday's food. And basically that's how the transmission of the Dharma works. You have to start afresh every new day. Okay, so much for today. All the best.